Well, I want to thank you all for two things. One, for all that you do for Virginia and for being here, and secondly, for putting up with all of us coming up here and telling you all the great things that we do. And one of the things that just amazed me is you go around the state and you listen to Virginians. They understand that we are in a crisis situation, but it's not really rocket science. Sometimes it's just stepping back and taking a perspective and having some common sense. Jerry told you what our majority leader, Eric Cantor, would say if he was here. I don't know what Eric would say. The only thing I know is that we are very proud in Virginia that we've got the majority leader of the House of Representatives who comes from Virginia and is fighting hard for Virginians. And the second thing that I've heard a lot of today is the word compromise. My dear friend Whit started that out. And it's something easy to talk about when we're in here. But when Whit was first raising it, and as each speaker came up and talked about compromise, it reminded me of a story I heard about an old farmer who lived in a portion of Virginia. And he had lived there for years, and he had a lake on his property, and there was a little outlet from the lake where his cattle and his livestock all went down and they watered in that lake. And somebody from New England who had made a lot of money up there decided to retire and have a retirement home right beside him. And he thought he owned that lake. And they talked about it back and forth, and finally this neighbor who'd come from New England bought an old boat and put the boat right in the outlet where the farmer's livestock would go out into the lake. And so one day the neighbor looks out and the farmer has come down with his truck and his son, and he's pulling an axe out of the back of the pickup truck, and he's walking towards the boat. Neighbor comes running down there and says, wait a minute, what are you going to do? He said, I'm getting ready to put the largest hole in that boat you've ever seen, and I'm going to sink it. And the neighbor said, can't we compromise on this? Can't we compromise? And the farmer said, sure. You want to compromise? We're okay. Gave the axe to his son, said, son, put the axe in the truck. Neighbor went back up to his house, and son looked at the father and said, Dad, what are you doing? Are you compromising? He said, sure, son. He said, I always believe in compromise. Go get me that drill. It doesn't matter whether I put 4 small holes in this boat or 1 big hole. It just is going to sink. And I want to tell you that one of the things that people are looking at today, in all of the sincerity of their hearts, it's not just whether they're Republicans or Democrats or whether they're from Virginia or California, but they see a nation that they're worried is sinking and is failing. And they realize it doesn't matter whether you put 5 or 6 small holes in it and make it sink or 1 large one. They just want to see it float. One of the things that breaks my heart is when I travel across Virginia Day for the first time in my career, I hear the same question from one person after the other. It's not what tax benefit are you going to get me or how are you going to help me with the new federal job. You know what they're asking me? Saying, Congressman, I just have one question for you. Is the future of America optimistic or is it pessimistic? And I see that from people who've lost their jobs, and I saw it from a guy the other day who's a Richmond company. Last year he made $35 million in his company. He's got $15 million of cash in the bank. They owe no debts, and he looked at me and he said, Randy, I'm thinking about selling out my business, letting all these people go. I've been in here for 40 years. But he said, I'm just tired of the government changing the rules on me from Monday to Friday. And I just have one question for you. Is the future of America optimistic or pessimistic? And at some point in time, we have to step back and not say what we're going to do, what we've done, but we have to ask ourselves, how did the greatest nation in the world get to a point where its citizens are asking, is the future of this country optimistic or is it pessimistic? And I think about the number one thing many of us talk about here is jobs and getting the economy turning around. And I remember I was at the Pentagon one day, and we were doing some mock-ups and some war games. Secretary of Defense was in there, a number of other people, and it was about swine flu and an epidemic that would come to the United States. And it was very realistic. They had monitors going, everything else. And they all said what they were going to do on each one of these situations to stop the swine flu. It got to me, and they said, what would you do? What would your first step be? And I said, my first step would be to pick up the telephone and call Joe Luter. Because I guarantee you, Smithfield Foods knows more about swine flu and more about security of their livestock than anybody sitting at this table. And they kind of laughed at first, but then the top veterinarian for the Army shook his head and said, yeah, that's the right thing to do. And if you want to know how to create jobs, we need to be listening to you instead of meeting in rooms and coming back and telling you this is what you need. There was a J.D. Power's book out recently, some of you probably read it, where it was a car manufacturer. I'm not going to mention the manufacturer. Some of you might have owned stock in it at one particular point in time. But their cars weren't selling very good in the United States. They hired J.D. Powers, and they said, go and tell us what we need to turn this around. And J.D. Powers did an in-depth analysis. They flew to Europe, walked into the president of the country, said, this is what your problem is. You've got the best engineered motor in the world. But the problem is it's so well engineered that when you get in it, all you have to do is turn the key on and it will start. But Americans, when they get in their car, first thing they want to do is press the accelerator down, and it's stalling your motor out. They said all you need to do is retool your motor so that when Americans get in there, they can press the accelerator and it'll still start. President of that company got up at his desk, according to J.D. Powers, pounded on the desk and said, those stupid Americans, we're going to educate them on how to start a car. That car is not being sold in the United States today. In fact, when I told a group of students around the country in a leadership forum about that, one of them said, what is that car? And I said, that's my point, because they didn't listen. And if you listen to business people, it's not very complex. Here's what they say. They say, we feel like we're on a track with our foreign competitors. And what you do is you start us out by putting this huge weight of regulation on us that our competitors aren't carrying, and you pat us on the back and say, run the lab. If we're still competitive and we get around the lab, instead of rewarding us, you know what you do? You come down and put a whole nother weight on us of taxation and say, now go ahead and run that race and you compete with that foreign competitor. And if I come around on the second lap and I'm still close, instead of rewarding me, you come back and put a whole weight of litigation on me that I have to bear, that my competitor's not bearing, and you want me to run again. And if miraculously I still manage to win that race, you walk up and take the prize away from me and say, now you're going to share it with everybody, even the people that didn't run in the race, and you wonder why we're not creating jobs and why we're not building things in the United States. And let me just tell you one or two last things. If you want to get jobs going, we need to stop doing the things that are killing jobs. Senator Warner came up here and told you a while ago about the Department of Labor. The Department of Labor comes out with a new regulation. They not only put it in effect on January 1st, they accelerate it to October 1st that would destroy our landscapers, our nurserymen, and they're talking about American jobs putting out of business because they're putting $3.60 more per hour on every H-2B worker that they have after these guys have already made contracts. That doesn't take rocket science. Just don't do it. If you want to build roads, I was just talking to Whit about it. We argue over funding, but all of us know oftentimes we get the funding and we still are 17, 18 years before we build a road. We just wrote a plan called the 414 plan. Look at the bridge in Minnesota that collapsed. We built that bridge back in 414 days. If we can do that, we can build every road project, every infrastructure project in America in 414 days or less. You know how you do it? Just say for the next 5 years, put a moratorium on every regulation that doesn't apply to safety or durability. And you want to see jobs created, you want to see roads being built, you want to see infrastructure taking place, it will shoot out if we did something like that. Then after 5 years, if you want to put all the regulations back on, raise the cost and slow down construction, do it. But at least give us 5 years to get a shot in the arm. The last thing I want to close with is something that's near and dear to my heart, and that is what we are getting ready to do to the defense of this country. It is going to transform the United States military, and I believe dismantle the greatest military the world has ever known. When we passed the stimulus bill, a lot of people looked and said, why don't you compromise? Why don't you just support that bill? It was $800 billion. I don't think it worked, but I'll suggest this to you. If you look at all the cuts that are coming down to the military now, from the compromises in the Senate, from sequestration, they're all around $860 billion, $800 billion. But let me tell you, every general, every admiral that's coming before us says this will transform our military in ways that we have never seen before. And if you don't think it hits your pocketbook, 90% of all the trade we do comes over the water. Do we really want a situation where we're looking at the Chinese and saying, is it okay if we travel through this area or not travel through it? And yet today, many people don't realize Chinese, for the first time in our lifetime, have more ships in their Navy than we have in their Navy, and they're on a curve coming up, and we're on a curve going down. The last thing I want to tell you on the spending is this. Forget all the strategic stuff. Forget all the stuff we have to live with every day. Secretary Panetta came out, and he's just said this: if we do these cuts that they're talking about, it will cost 1.5 million jobs in the United States. But let's say he's wrong. Let's take the most conservative figure we've seen, which is 500,000 jobs. We talk about unemployment. The cuts we're going to make to the military men and women in this country, and to the workforce that comes from that, and to the industrial base, will equal all of the people unemployed in West Virginia, New Mexico, Maine, Nebraska, Montana, Hawaii, New Hampshire, Delaware, Alaska, South Dakota, Vermont, Wyoming, and North Dakota combined. Do we really want to go down that road? And so I would just say in closing this: it's not that complicated. We need to just step back and say this: this is the greatest nation the world has ever known. Our future will be optimistic, because the price of it not being is too great for the world. And we will not sacrifice the greatest military the world has ever known, because, as the Chinese defense minister said in December, the only way China becomes a great nation is to have a strong economy and a strong military. You unravel one, you unravel the other. I believe the same thing is true for this great nation you and I are proud to live in. Thank you for what you do, for letting me be here with you.